Hello, my name is Kieran Morris. I've lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota since I was born. If you're from here, there's a good chance you probably know me. People always say it's a small city. For a lot of my 22 years, I've thought of my home as an inconsequential place. It's a beautiful place. It's full of vibrant immigrant communities and centers of art and culture, lots of green space and nature, but by and large, I really thought of us as a frontier town on the world stage. And as I record this on Monday, the 1st of June, 2020, this has changed. Across the entire country, demonstrators and police have begun a dance of civil disorder that is only spreading. Like all blazes, though, it had a point of origin, a spark, if you will, that lit the inferno, and that spark was ignited here, in my green hometown of lakes and bridges. Over the past few days, I've been reminded again and again of the lyrics from Rage Against the Machine's song Guerrilla Radio. This has to start someplace, this has to start sometime. What better place than here? What better time than now? As a lifelong resident of Minneapolis, a city that I now know will be remembered, I feel that I have to speak out and give the perspective of someone who played as a child on streets that are now covered in ashes and broken glass, as someone who lost his martial arts school and his favorite bookstores and restaurants, as someone who has friends that have been hospitalized because of brutality. I've been there myself. I've seen military helicopters fly above my apartment building, and not a block from my house, a semi truck drove through a crowd of peaceful protesters. I've been there myself. I've seen the flash of concussion grenades not feet away. I've been charged by horses. I've been shot in the back with a rubber bullet. And I know that as time goes on, there are going to be interested parties who want to spin our city's story for their own ends. And as someone with feet on the ground, I feel that it's my duty to set the record straight with a direct personal account of what I've seen in my community members, in our police force, and really as this spreads further in our country as a whole. The facts of George Floyd's death are unavoidable. They were caught on camera, they were uploaded to the world. They are a prime example of the connective power that we as individuals have to shed light on injustice. And as an African American man, as someone who grew up in the same area where he was murdered, I felt this rush of anger, this visceral need to do something in protesting his death. And there's a history of disproportionate mistreatment of black men by our police department. If you doubt this, you can go and look at statistics online compiled by organizations like the ACLU. Off the top of my head, we live in a city with a population of over 400,000 people. And of those, only 18% are black, yet 52% of excessive force complaints against the police are made by black residents of this city. And adding on top of that the fact that so many of the officers policing our communities are not from the communities. The man who killed George Floyd was from Oakdale. That's an outlying suburb, and that means that he's not someone with a tangible link to the place that he's supposed to be protecting. So all of these factors together made me feel a need, and I think made hundreds of other people feel a need to get out there and to do something to change the way that our law enforcement is handled. So as a matter of direct empathy and loyalty to my community, I took to 38th in Chicago with hundreds of others to protest peacefully what was, if we're being honest, the public execution of a man, of a community member, by an officer of the law who is not from the community he was killed in. And beyond these reasonings, I really thought about the system that allowed George Floyd to be killed, and the fact that so often we value material and financial gains over, direct human cost. The fact that we are empowering a caste of our society to have the ability to kill people for potentially carrying a piece of paper with the wrong markings on it. I want you to really think about that. And so we all had our reasons for marching, and they compounded with the fear and the pain of these deaths in not only our own communities, but in those across the nation. And we marched together down across windswept Hiawatha Avenue and towards the 3rd Precinct. I walked with folks of all races, Latinx folks, white folks, indigenous folks who are facing their own plethora of problems in this state, Asian folks, and everything in between. And of course, there was debate about how these protests should be handled. Some people thought that we should stay where he was killed in solidarity. Others thought that we should move on and directly confront those that were responsible for his death. It wasn't as organized as it could have been, but for an event that many of us had only heard about that day, the turnout was amazing, and it was profoundly healing to be a part of. And when we reached 3rd Precinct and gathered, things were still calm. There were speeches on megaphones, there were drum beats played out to the rhythm of chants, and above all of it, though, you could feel this tension, being in the presence of a place that was so intimately tied to those that had committed George's death. And adding to that tension was the fact that there were no police in sight. I remember standing there in the crowd in the moment when people started running and when herd mentality kicked in, as it has so much over the past few days, and more people started running. And of course, I thought someone was being beat on. So I ran myself and I yelled for other people to follow. And I rounded the corner and I saw the windshield of a police SUV getting smashed in. And at that moment, I knew things had changed, and I knew that they weren't going to be the same, maybe ever. And of course, it escalated from there as anger over George's murder was funneled into the possessions of those who had committed it. The fences to the motor pool came down, windows were broken in on the precinct, and rain began to pour on all of it. It really made it feel like a dream. And there was still conflict between protesters. Some people wanted to preserve the peace of the march, other people wanted to be a part of that violent action. I know a lot of people like me were just caught in the middle, because in a sense there was a satisfying element to watch the direct representations of a corrupt system be destroyed. But I also knew that these victories were almost symbolic in a sense, because the police were going to be there soon, and they were going to use this to escalate the situation into something where it was human lives at stake as opposed to SUVs. And of course, a few minutes later, concussion grenades started going off. Teams in black riot armor started coming down the alley. And, for those of us who had come to protest peacefully, there was now an audience. We were screaming George Floyd's name to more than just the air. And, as I watched those two sides assemble and the standoff begin, I couldn't begin to imagine the level of conviction and of brutality that was brought down upon what was a peaceful protest. I think people threw some plastic water bottles, but what is that to a man in riot armor standing behind a fence? And what I really want to emphasize about that first day is that although it began as an act of destruction of police property by protesters, the level of violence that it was met with was completely unwarranted. And not only that, it was directed towards the non-violent aspects of the protest. I watched police allow the rioters and the looters that people are talking about now to go about their work pretty much completely unheeded while bringing it down on us. And this is something that it only intensified over the next few days. As I watched rubber bullets tear down from the shooters on the top of the precinct and into the crowds, I lost one of my friends, and I turned to run, and I took one in the back. And I fell down in the grass at the feet of a woman who told me she was a nurse, and she asked me if there was anything she could do. And as the protest continued, it was people like her who really made a difference for those who had gone down to gas or to rubber bullets or to being hit by a gas canister. and those medics marked themselves with red crosses. They started carrying bags full of supplies, and I watched again and again and again as they were targeted specifically while kneeling down to help people who had fallen. And when you look at pictures captured by protesters of the police up on top of the precinct smiling and laughing while they shot down at us, it really puts a perspective on the emotional scope of this situation, and on the people who are supposed to be our protectors. I know that questions of looting and community destruction have come up quite a bit over the past week. And my worry is that that is drawing the conversation away from the human cost and onto the material one. I can understand why people are focusing on these images because they are more dramatic than really anything that's been seen in this nation before. A police precinct being burned to the ground. But at the end of the day, buildings can be rebuilt, buildings are insured, and people can't. And the things I've seen, drive-bys across the front of a crowd with mace, being charged by horses, headshots again and again and again with canisters and rubber bullets. I know that if the wrong person gets hit in the wrong place, they are going to die. And I want to emphasize that these acts of destruction in our communities that are being talked about are being allowed, but more than that, I think they're being encouraged. More than once, I've seen, members of protests who did not fit in, who weren't chanting, who weren't protesting, incite acts of violence and smash out windows, even when other protesters were telling them not to give the police an excuse to come down harder on us. And I think, people talk about if rioting is a valid form of protest, and honestly, that's not for me to say. But I can tell you that it is not a sustainable one. And the people of Minneapolis seem to see that. We're coming together to form aid stations, to institute community cleanup, and to watch our neighborhoods and keep them safe. People are donating thousands of dollars, and they're offering the services of their cars and their homes to shelter protesters and to keep them mobile and safe. Food drives are being set up to feed the people whose sources of sustenance were destroyed in this chaos. And I think, really more dangerous than the police response itself, and more dangerous than this destruction to our communities, is the misinformation which has infected our city. I'm seeing reports of the KKK in our communities, but I haven't seen a single picture. I haven't seen a single video. And if you have them, please share. But for now, it's like there's so much paranoia. People talking about lethal force being employed by the military elements in our city. Like I talked about before, people talking about police agitators in the crowds. And I think the only way that we can combat this misinformation, the only way that we can prevent this from happening in the future, is to come together as a community. Some of the most profound and impressive work I've seen has been done by neighborhood councils who are coming together to discuss these events and formulate plans for continued relief and support. Truly, I've never seen people come together and get past the things that so often get in the way of us. Race, religion, sexual orientation, and age. People on all areas of this spectrum have been out there. They've been protesting. They've been supporting from the sidelines. They've been setting up centers of triage to take care of people who are wounded. I think about the fact that never before have I seen teachers and coworkers and exes and friends and pizza guys that have delivered to my house and priests all at the same events. And I want these things to be focused on as opposed to destruction, no matter how dramatic those images of fire and fallen buildings are, because ultimately what we're doing as a city is combating the system that allowed George Floyd to be murdered in the first place. The Minneapolis police has shown inhuman levels of sadism and neglect, and we as a community are proving that we don't need their ministrations to survive. We're capable of organizing and networking neighborhood watch groups. We're capable of feeding ourselves and creating a civilian supply chain of medical supplies and aid stations. And I think it's as we move on, we have to organize beyond our immediate anger at the death of our brother George Floyd, and we have to create something that will serve and represent us better as citizens so that no one like him will ever have to die again. And I really do want to acknowledge the work being done by our governor and by Mayor Frey in the face of this. I can see the compassion and the understanding in the responses of both, but I can also see how bureaucracy and the intervention of people like the police union and really our president have made justice difficult to serve. And I think that ultimately we as the people, we have to decide to do our own part in building a better world and strengthening our communities from within and educating our children to understand that they have the ability to rise above their circumstances. And honestly, I can see that we're doing that. And so I guess to close this out, I want to make statements to three groups of people. To my fellow Minneapolis residents, your resolve, your strength, and your compassion has been unparalleled in these dark times. Black, white, Latinx, Asian, indigenous, and everything in between. I am immensely honored to even have been here to witness your courage and your ability to network as a community. And now I think we need to look forward and we need to network even more, and we have to make sure that the spirit of these demonstrations does not die once they do. I know that I've gotten to know my immediate neighbors better in the last week than in the last year. And I think that we need to take time to talk in our communities, to share our fears and our hopes, and to render plans for further organization as human beings. This goes for protesters too. We need to fight this system, but I've seen too many people needlessly injured by a force that does not care about you or your well-being. We can't fight that system directly with mindless violence. It will always win. Look at the helicopters in our skies. Look at the troops on our streets. This fight must be fought, but we have to do it in a sustainable, organized way. As Brother Malcolm said, by any means necessary. To those people watching out in the world, I want you to take the example set by my city and apply it to your own. Come together as a community, get to know your neighbors and leaders as human beings, and decide what fate you want to make for yourselves. For far too long, these systems of capital and dehumanization have determined that the rich and their henchmen get to rule the day, and we need to reject conventions and embrace all possibilities for ourselves as human beings going forward. And any help or support that you can offer my city is appreciated. I know that we need it. And the last group I want to talk to is the police, to the National Guard, to the rank and file that has been forced into sleepless nights of being screamed at and cornered by the masses. Look, I know you're exhausted. I know you're depressed. I know you feel universally hated. And just know that it doesn't need to be that way. You could be out there marching by our side like police are in New Jersey. You could be striking until those other 4 officers are charged. You could be breaking ranks to stop your fellow officers of the law from committing savage acts of violence against the people that you're supposed to be out here protecting. Ultimately, you could have prevented all of this in the first place because you're no different from us. You're just people trying to survive in a system that is huge and uncaring about your life or your fate. And if you truly are defenders of the law, then you'll stand with us, and we will stand together.